Welcome to the debate. So I want you to imagine that your neighborhood is under this immediate existential threat from heavily armed invaders.
Okay, a pretty stressful scenario, but I'm with you.
Right. And for generations, your community has relied on basically a neighborhood watch, citizens bringing their own gear, leaving their day jobs to stand guard, and then just going back home when the coast is clear.
Which works fine for minor threats, sure.
Exactly. But suddenly, the threat is just too massive. The citizens are exhausted, they're bankrupt, they are totally out of gear. Your only option to survive is to hire a massive private security firm.
Ah, I see where this is going.
But there's a catch, right? You can't afford to pay them a salary. So you tell these heavily armed guards, they will operate entirely on commission, based on whatever they can take from the invaders.
And then I assume you act completely surprised when, a few years later, those heavily armed guards realize they don't actually need to listen to the neighborhood council anymore.
Right, because the council isn't signing their paychecks.
Exactly. The guards just own the street now.
And that analogy brings us to our topic today. We are digging into one of the most consequential, really high-stakes structural shifts in human history. We're looking at the Roman Republic in the year 107 BC.
A very bad year for Rome.
Horrifying year. Rome is facing a dual threat. Down in North Africa, they are bogged down in the Jugurthine War, which is this brutal, logistical nightmare of a guerrilla conflict.
Yeah, and it was completely exposing the corruption and incompetence of the Roman elite at the time.
Absolutely, and simultaneously up north, you have massive migrating Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and the Teutones, and they are just bearing down on Italy.
And, we should probably clarify for the listener. These were not just raiding parties. These were entire migrating nations. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people, wagons, families, warriors.
Right, a total demographic displacement.
Exactly. And they had just inflicted on Rome one of its absolute worst defeats in history at the Battle of Arausio. I mean, Rome lost tens of thousands of men in a single day.
They are completely out of soldiers because, for centuries, the Roman military was fundamentally a militia. To serve, you had to be part of the assiduii, a property-owning citizen.
The idea being that you needed a vested interest in the state to fight for it.
Right, it was a civic duty. But by 107 BC, that system was totally shattered. Rome's empire had just grown too large. I mean, you can't ask a farmer to leave his fields for a 5-year campaign in Spain and expect his farm to survive.
Because the wealthy elites were just buying up those abandoned small farms, right? Creating those massive latifundia, the huge slave-run agricultural estates.
Exactly. The traditional middle class just evaporated. And into this crisis steps Gaius Marius, a brilliant general, a new man from outside the traditional aristocracy who steps up and fundamentally changes the rules of the game to save Rome.
He recruits the destitute, the capid censi, literally the head count, men with absolutely zero property.
Yep.
He has the state supply their weapons. And in doing so, he essentially professionalizes the military. But, the central focus of our analysis today is the ultimate price tag of that survival.
Right, the core question. Did the reforms of Gaius Marius serve as a vital, necessary evolution that saved Rome from destruction, with, the Republic's later fall just being a failure of political management?
Or, and this is where I stand, did these military changes inherently poison the Republic? Did they permanently shift the loyalty of the Roman legions away from the state and directly into the hands of ambitious generals, making the fall of the Republic inevitable?
Well, I will be arguing that Marius enacted a brilliant, pragmatic, and absolute necessity. Rome was staring down the barrel of annihilation. By recruiting the landless poor, he didn't just save the Republic from the Germanic tribes, he modernized an antiquated city-state militia into the most formidable professional fighting force the ancient world had ever seen.
Which militarily is undeniably true. But at what cost?
Well, I firmly believe the subsequent dependency of those soldiers on their generals was not some inherent baked-in flaw of the military design. It was a catastrophic, totally preventable political failure by a rigid Senate that just utterly refused to manage the social contract with its new professional class.
And I'll be arguing that while the immediate tactical crisis of the Cimbri was definitely real, The strategic consequence was a fatal wound to the civic foundation of Rome. Marius's reforms saved Rome in the short term, but they absolutely created the prerequisites for the fall of the Republic.
By professionalizing the army?
By transforming military service from a shared civic duty into a profit-driven career for the destitute, Marius fundamentally broke the state. The Republic became an abstraction. Soldiers no longer fought for the Senate, they fought for their commanders, whose military success dictated their physical survival and their financial livelihood.
So you're saying the structure itself was doomed?
Yes, that shift in legionary loyalty made the rise of warlords and the ultimate violent death of the Republic an absolute inevitability.
Well, let's start with the sheer physical reality on the ground in 107 BC. Because, we really can't analyze the Marian reforms without looking at the fact that the political avenue for saving the Republic's traditional army had already been violently shut down.
You're talking about the Gracchus.
Exactly. If you're listening today, you might think, well, if they needed land-owning soldiers, why not just pass a law to give land back to the poor?
Which they tried to do decades earlier with the Gracchi brothers.
Right. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus saw this exact same crisis building up. They saw the small citizen farmers being swallowed by the massive patrician slave estates. And they tried to solve the recruitment crisis through politics.
Through agrarian reform.
Yeah, they proposed strictly enforcing old laws, limiting how much public land the elites could hoard, and redistributing that land to the poor. Because mathematically, if you create more landowners, you organically create more eligible soldiers. It was the traditional constitutional solution.
But the Roman Senate, who were frankly desperate to protect their immense illegal wealth, they resorted to outright political violence. They bludgeoned Tiberius to death with the legs of wooden benches in 133 BC.
A horrific escalation.
And then a decade later, they drove his brother Gaius to suicide and slaughtered, 3,000 of his followers?
Exactly. So they proved to everyone that reform could no longer come through peaceful legislative means. So when Marius takes command, he is looking at a dead political system and a very live Germanic threat.
The Cimbri were absolutely going to burn Rome to the ground, yeah.
Right. So Marius had to use the landless masses. He bypassed the political stalemate with a military loophole because there was literally no other option to put armed men in the field. His unprecedented string of consulships, he was elected 7 times, shows exactly how desperately Rome relied on his military machine just to physically survive.
Okay, I don't deny the terrifying urgency of the Cimbrian threat. But bypassing a political stalemate with a military loophole didn't actually solve the core issue. It merely replaced an agrarian crisis with a warlord crisis.
I don't see how.
Well, look at it this way. By arming a desperate, disenfranchised underclass and tying their financial future entirely to war plunder, Marius structurally guaranteed that this system would eventually backfire and consume the civilian government.
Wait, I really have to push back there. You're framing the warlord crisis as an inevitable product of the military reform itself. But let's look at the actual mechanics of what Marius did. It was simply a change in recruitment and standardization.
Simply a change?
Operationally, yes. Marius made the state pay for the weapons. He standardized training. He reorganized the legions into cohorts. He didn't, write a constitutional amendment saying, soldiers must now betray the Senate.
He didn't have to write a law. The socioeconomic reality of the capite censi wrote the law for him. These were men with absolutely nothing. No land, no farms to return to, no generational wealth.
Right, which made them willing to serve long term.
But under the old system, men fought to protect the farms they already owned. When Marius's new recruits joined the legions, they were fighting to acquire a future. They expected a plot of land and a retirement bonus when their service was done. Marius essentially invented a twisted version of a welfare state, but channeled exclusively through the military.
But that is exactly my point. Because the Senate refused to provide basic social safety nets, the army became the sole engine for social mobility. But who should have provided that land and that bonus?
Well, in an ideal world, the state.
Yes, the Roman state. If the Senate had simply recognized, okay, we now have a professional standing army, and instituted a regular, state-backed system of pensions and land grants for veterans, those soldiers would have remained fiercely loyal to the Republic. The generals wouldn't have had any political leverage over them at all.
I'm sorry, but that is a highly idealized, almost modern view of how states function. If you're listening today, it's really tempting to think, why didn't the government just create a Department of Veteran Affairs, raise taxes, and pay them?
Right, it seems obvious to us.
Because Rome didn't have an IRS. It didn't have a centralized, neutral bureaucracy. The Roman state was governed by a hyper-competitive oligarchy of aristocratic factions who were constantly vying for dignitas.
Which is their concept of reputation and political clout.
Exactly. And you are asking a patrician elite whose entire economic model was built on hoarding conquered land for their massive slave estates to suddenly start carving up that wealth and giving it to the poor out of the goodness of their hearts. The Senate was never, ever going to do that voluntarily.
But that is still a political failure, not a military one. Blaming the professional army structure for Caesar crossing the Rubicon decades later is like blaming the invention of the sword for the existence of murder.
That's a clever analogy, but
it holds up. The tool is neutral. The wielder and the environment define the outcome. Marius built a highly efficient tool. The Senate wanted the security of a professional army, but they insisted on clinging to the financial model of a city-state militia. That cognitive dissonance is what broke the Republic, not the legions themselves.
I have to strongly disagree. The tool was absolutely not neutral, and we have to look at the mechanics of why. You really cannot separate Marius's military changes from the Roman cultural concept of clientela, the patron-client relationship.
The mutual obligations between classes.
Right. Roman society was deeply hierarchical. The wealthy patron provides legal protection and money. The poorer client provides political support and votes. What Marius did was map that specific cultural dynamic onto the military on an industrial scale.
So you're saying the general becomes the ultimate patron?
Precisely. The state in Rome was incredibly abstract to a poor recruit. It was just a collection of distant, wealthy magistrates in a marble building who actively hated them. But the general?
The general is right there with them.
Exactly. The general was the man bleeding in the mud alongside you. He was the one organizing the logistics so you didn't starve to death in Gaul or North Africa. And, mechanically speaking, he was the one who had to personally secure your retirement. Let's walk through that mechanism. How did a Roman veteran actually get his land?
Well, the general had to go back to Rome and force it through the political system.
Right. The state didn't automatically mail them a deed. The general had to return to Rome, ally with political tribunes, and physically intimidate the voting assemblies with his own veterans just to force the Senate to pass a land bill.
Which was incredibly destabilizing.
Utterly destabilizing. The general was their provider, their lobbyist, and their hero. The dependency on generals wasn't an accident. It was baked into the fabric of a system where the poorest citizens relied entirely on conquest for survival.
Okay, I completely agree that the general acted as the patron. But again, that dynamic was amplified precisely because the civilian government abdicated its responsibility. Look at how Marius himself struggled.
You mean after the Cimbrian War?
Yes. After he literally saved Rome from the Germanic tribes, he had to ally with a radical tribune named Saturninus just to get land for the veterans who had just saved the city from burning. And the Senate fought him every single step of the way, even resorting to mob violence again.
They did.
So when the soldiers saw that the Senate was actively trying to deny them the land they had just bled for, of course they turned to their commanders. But that's a reactive dynamic. It is not an inherent feature of a professional military.
You can argue it's reactive in theory, but when a system inevitably explodes the very first time it is put to the test, you really have to admit the design is fundamentally flawed. We don't even have to look decades down the line to Caesar to see this system collapse.
You're jumping to the social war? I'm jumping to Sulla in 88 BC, 19 years after Marius's reforms. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius's former lieutenant and eventually his most bitter rival.
Yes. In 88 BC, Sulla is a consul and is legally given command of a highly lucrative war in the east against King Mithridates. Now, Marius is aging, but he is consumed by jealousy and wants the command for himself.
Right, a classic clash of egos.
So Marius uses a corrupt tribune to legally strip Sulla of that command and transfer it to himself. Sulla is furious. He goes to his legions. Now let's look at the mechanics of what happens next. What does Sulla tell his men? Does he argue the constitutional legality of the tribune's veto?
No, he tells them that Marius is going to take his own veterans to the east, and Sulla's men will lose out on the plunder.
Exactly. He appeals entirely to their financial self-interest. And as a direct result of the system Marius himself created, Sulla's troops stone the civilian envoys to death, and they march on Rome.
Which was a massive taboo.
It's the first time in history a Roman general leads Roman legions to attack their own city. They slaughter their political enemies. This isn't some distant consequence. This is less than 2 decades after the Marian reforms. The system didn't just have a potential flaw, it was inherently destructive to the Republic from the moment it was tested by a disgruntled paymaster.
Okay, but you are placing the blame for Sulla's march on the military structure, and you're skipping over a massive piece of political context that forced his hand.
Which is?
The factionalism. By 88 BC, you have a deeply factionalized elite. You have the Optimates, the traditional, conservative aristocrats who want power concentrated in the Senate, and the Populares, politicians who bypass the Senate to pass laws directly through the popular assemblies.
True, the political climate was incredibly toxic.
Right, so Marius's attempt to steal Sulla's command using a tribune wasn't just some minor procedural slight. It was a blatant, unprecedented political maneuver that completely violated the traditions of the Republic. Sulla marched on Rome because the rule of law had already broken down.
But the military mechanics provided the means to escalate that breakdown into an absolute apocalypse. Before Marius, if a politician was angry, he could raise a mob in the forum with clubs and daggers. That's a riot.
Sure.
After Marius, a disgruntled politician could raise 6 legions of heavily armed, fiercely loyal veterans who cared absolutely nothing for the Senate. That's a civil war. Marius transformed the scale of political violence. By making the army a career for men who had no stake in the civic life of the Republic, he essentially weaponized poverty.
Well, let's talk about what that weaponized poverty actually achieved, though. Because you are focusing entirely on the collapse of the Republican political structure. But what about the Roman state as a civilization?
What do you mean?
I mean the city-state model of the early Republic governed by rotating magistrates on one-year terms, relying on a militia of farmers who had to go home for the harvest. That system was completely incapable of managing a vast Mediterranean empire.
Well, it was certainly straining under the weight of its own conquests, I'll grant you that.
It was breaking. It couldn't sustain long-term garrisons in Spain. It couldn't manage extended, multi-year campaigns in Asia Minor. The Marian reforms created a highly disciplined, standardized, standing army.
Yes, they were very effective at conquering.
But more than that, it was this exact professional military that allowed Rome to transition into an empire that maintained the Pax Romana for centuries. The legions built the massive road networks. They secured the frontiers. They spread Roman law, architecture, and culture from Britain all the way to the Euphrates.
So the military changes saved Rome by turning it into something else entirely.
They forced it to evolve. The Republic died, yes, but the Roman civilization survived and flourished precisely because Marius gave them the professional army required to govern the known world.
That is a fascinating way to frame it, but we really have to seriously consider the cost of that transition. You're essentially arguing that the ends justify the means. Yes, the empire survived, but what did it survive as?
As an incredibly stable global superpower.
As a military dictatorship, the peace of the Pax Romana was maintained entirely at the tip of a sword, and the emperors themselves became hostages to the very military machine that Marius created.
Hostages in what sense?
Look at the mechanics of imperial Rome. Look at the crisis of the 3rd century, or even just the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD. Once the precedent was set that the legions, not the Senate, held the true power, the army became the sole arbiter of the state.
Well, they definitely had outsized political influence.
Outsized? Emperors were made and unmade by the Praetorian Guard or the frontier legions in Germany and Syria. Emperors were literally assassinated for not paying high enough bonuses. The civic foundation of Rome, this idea of a republic governed by laws, consent, and shared civic duty, was entirely obliterated.
But
Marius may have built a machine capable of conquering the world, but he ensured that Rome would be forever ruled by raw, physical force, not by law.
okay, but let's be intellectually honest about that civic foundation you're defending. It was already a total illusion by 107 BC.
The republic you're mourning was a ruthless oligarchy where a few dozen families hoarded all the wealth, violently suppressed any attempt at land reform, and happily let the working class starve while their agricultural monopolies grew.
I'm not defending the Senate's corruption, but the structure of a republic.
The structure was dead. Marius didn't kill a functioning democracy. He provided a brutally realistic solution to a system that had already failed its citizens. He offered the destitute a path to dignity, wealth, and social mobility through military service.
By turning them into mercenaries for warlords?
The fact that the Senate's incompetence eventually allowed the generals to hijack that system is a tragedy, I agree. But it does not negate the existential necessity of the reform itself. Look, if Marius doesn't reform the army, the Germanic tribes pour into Italy, sack Rome, and the Republic ends right there in the 2nd century BC. There is no Caesar, no Augustus, no Pax Romana. There is just ash. He saved the neighborhood.
He saved the neighborhood by handing the keys to a mercenary security force that immediately locked the citizens out of their own homes. You really cannot claim a reform is a success if its direct structural consequence is a century of devastating civil wars.
I think direct consequence is a stretch.
It's a straight line. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, they all utilized the exact same mechanical blueprint that Marius invented. Raise an army of the poor, win foreign glory, personally enrich your soldiers, and then use those loyal soldiers to intimidate or conquer the state. It became a mathematical formula for tyranny. The tactical necessity of fighting the Cimbri just does not excuse the strategic blindness of creating an army that answers to no one but its paymaster.
Well, as we step back from the specific historical mechanics, it's time to pull our thoughts together. I maintain that Gaius Marius enacted a brilliant, completely necessary evolution. The traditional citizen militia was dead, killed by the greed of the patrician class and the logistical realities of a sprawling empire.
Killed by greed, sure, but replaced by something far more dangerous.
Of Roman dominance. The ensuing tragedy, the civil wars, the rise of dictators, was not a mechanical flaw of a professional army. It was the fault of a rigid, self-interested Senate that utterly refused to adapt and manage the social contract with its new professional soldiers.
And I remain steadfast that while the immediate tactical crisis was real, the strategic consequence of the Marian reforms was fatal. Marius permanently altered the psychology and the socioeconomic structure of the Roman military.
By giving the poor a chance to fight?
By turning citizen soldiers into dependent professionals whose entire financial future relied on plunder, he ensured they would look to their generals, not the state, for survival. He inadvertently created a system of private armies, making the shift of legionary loyalty to warlords like Sulla and Caesar and the violent death of the Republic and absolute inevitability.
Yet, despite our profound disagreement on whether this disaster could have been avoided, we clearly converge on one critical point.
We do. Marius fundamentally and permanently altered the power dynamics of the Roman world.
Exactly. The army was no longer a tool of the state. It became an independent political force, an entity unto itself that would dictate the fate of the Mediterranean for the next 500 years.
We absolutely agree there. I mean, the Rubicon was theoretically crossed long before Julius Caesar ever reached its banks, right? It was crossed the moment a Roman soldier realized his loyalty belonged to the man handing him his pay and his land, rather than the abstract city that sent him.
That's a great way to put it. It leaves us with a lingering question, one that really echoes far beyond the marble halls of the Senate. Think back to our neighborhood watch and the private security firm.
Right, the mercenary guards.
If an emergency measure physically saves a nation, but in doing so forever alters its civic DNA and guarantees the collapse of its founding institutions, was the intervention a triumph of survival or just the beginning of the end?
It's a heavy question.
It is. And there is so much more to explore regarding how Rome's military evolution shaped its ultimate imperial destiny. We leave it to you to consider the cost of survival. Thank you for joining us.